Yeah, let's start. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining on a Saturday. It shows some real commitment. My name is Jamil Lakhdar Hamina. I am going to be hosting this meeting. I work at Cosmonaut. And so today we're going to be having a comradely debate discussion on Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, and what's going on. So first, let me state how things are going to go, the format of this. And secondly, I'll introduce our speakers. So first off, we're going to have the opening remarks by each person. We're going to give each person about 10 to 15 minutes. I'll allow for 20, but really hopefully we can hit the 10-15 mark. After that, we will allow the speakers to respond to each other. We'll do 2 rounds of that. Each person will have about 2 to 5 minutes for a response. And finally, we'll open it up to Q&A and see what you guys have to say, what you guys have to ask. And that will be about 20 to 30 minutes is the hope. So first off, I am, as I said, my name is Jamil Lakhdar Hamina. Let me introduce our speakers. So first off, speaking first and giving opening remarks is Donald Parkinson. He's editor-in-chief at Cosmonaut. And he's also secretary of his chapter at DSA. And Donald, can you remind me? It's the Space
Coast DSA, and I'm a co-chair.
Very, very cool stuff. Next, we have Margosha Cherniak, a Soviet Jewish organizer for the DSA and the International Committee. Next, we have Sam Heft-Luthy, member of Red Star Caucus and secretary of California DSA. And finally, we have Aaron Amaral, who is a longtime revolutionary socialist and activist in the anti-war, anti-imperialist, and international solidarity movements. And he is a member of the Tempest collective. So I want to thank you all for being here. It's a real joy to have you here, and thank you for participating. I think this should be a very interesting event. And having said all of that, I now open it up to my comrade Donald to give sort of the opening remarks, setting up the stage for the discussion.
Yeah, I kind of wrote these not so much to lay out a clear political position, which I do lay out in a letter I wrote to Cosmonaut, but I'm more so trying to give what I would consider a kind of historical materialist, perhaps, analysis of this basic conflict and what is going on, to kind of set up a discussion for us to be able to kind of more effectively come to a proletarian position. So we are approximately 4 months into what is clearly a conflict that will shape world history from here on. Across the political spectrum, there is no doubt about this. Yet, here we see any agreement fall apart. One's position on the Ukraine war is not predictable based on one's location, any kind of left-right spectrum. We have people on the left enthusiastically taking all kinds of different sides in the war, and we also have people in the right taking a variety of different sides on this war. The correct stance to take on the Ukraine war is not obvious, and instead of these kind of reactive responses, we need to have a realistic analysis of what is at stake in the war and what the class forces are. Most of us have heard, the famous quote by Clausewitz, "War is politics by other means." I think this is relevant because the motives behind Russia's special military operation, as they call it, must be understood in political, not necessarily economic terms. This is not to say that economics is irrelevant and that politics isn't, determined at least partly by economics. But I think that when we're looking at the causes of this war, we do kind of have to start from the abstraction of politics and states. And I don't think that kind of vulgar economic explanations for this war work, because Russia is not fighting just for access to new raw materials and new markets. It's fighting to assert the Russian state as a geopolitical unit that holds its own sphere of influence And this isn't to say that things are beyond economics, but kind of economistic understandings like Putin wants Ukrainian coal don't really work. After all, if Russia was inspired by purely economic motives, then it would not have started this invasion, or if you want to call it a special military operation, whatever you want to call it, before the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, as Maxim Lebsky, the Russian Marxist, has pointed out. And some have tried to argue that it can be understood in terms of competition over wheat markets in Russia and Ukraine, but it doesn't make sense to start this war because it destabilizes the global food market. And it doesn't make sense if that's what it's trying to do, is to conquer the global food market. It doesn't make sense to destabilize it in the way that it has, and invite all these sanctions upon them, the Russian sense. So essentially, kind of mercantile economic interests in the most basic sense did not prevail. So I think instead we have to understand this war in terms of various different state building projects. And these state building projects exist in a global system composed of different world powers competing within a single world system that is defined by a kind of rules-based order that is set out by the hegemonic power, which is the USA. The USA is the hegemonic state in the world system, even if, it is declining hegemon, or at least in a relative decline. I still think you can pretty precisely say the US is the world hegemon. So states are primarily just protection rackets for the property classes of any given nation. But no one would tolerate a state if it didn't pretend to be something more than a protection racket. And this is where the need for nationalism, ideology, and nation building projects come in, because they provide a sense of purpose and integration between hostile classes within a society by creating a purpose common to all of these different classes. And this is just as much true as it is in Ukraine as it is in Russia. I think we have to both understand both of these states as state building projects defined by the aims of different ruling class fractions. And so, yes, these are economic projects because they are ruling class projects that rest upon, different social formations. I don't think they can be reduced to economics. So for Russia, this project of state building is an attempt to reclaim a unity of the Russian people. This is often done by appealing to this idea of, a single ancient Russian people with a common historical past that needs to be reunited. And so this is essentially a kind of, it's almost not even nation building. It's like kind of idea of like a civilizational state. You have these kind of ideas of Eurasianism. And it's a kind of imperial vision, not in the capitalist sense of imperialism, but in the more, I guess, pre-capitalist imperial sense. Not to say that Russia is pre-capitalist, but I think its kind of vision of state building does rely on this idea of a kind of imperial greater Russia. And the idea is that this, there's several different peoples that define Russia, but they are all connected through this kind of ancient unity of the great Russians. But on the other hand, we have the state building project of Ukraine, which is exactly a nation building project that is primarily based on a particularist identity. It defines itself in separation from this great Russian project. Ukraine also phrases its nation building project in terms of connection to an ancient history, drawing a historical line from the Rus Ukraine, Prince Volodymyr, and modern Ukraine. Well, it was a common talking point that Ukraine is a fake nation. It is in many ways just as fake, quote unquote, as Russia. Both are essentially state building projects that rely on a continuity with ancient history in order to validate themselves. Two different notions of national identity clash, and connected to each of these national identities are geopolitical blocks that exist within the context of a world capitalist system. And I highly recommend reading the Maxim Lebsky article, Putin and the Project of a Big Russian Nation on Cosmonaut. It's a very good historical tracing out of all these different nation building projects. And I don't really have time to do what he does and explain these different historical configurations, But I'm going to try to kind of summarize the basics. So what is important to understand is that the pre-1917 Russian Empire largely failed to actually integrate its periphery into a single Russified project. Language, ethnicity, religion, cultural kinship, all were able to create a spontaneous Russian nation. They were not able to unite all the different peoples into one strongly unified Russian Empire. As the notion of a kind of mythic single past that all these people shared did not actually serve to glue these people together and hold them together. So Lebsky points out that the system of mass education, an extensive bureaucratic network, industrial production, and communications actually is what serves as the glue that holds together state-building projects and projects of national formation. And that the kind of idea that we can just appeal to one common mythic past does not actually create a kind of spontaneous unity in nation-building projects. It was the USSR that actually created the means to create a larger geopolitical unity that included both Russia and Ukraine. But this also meant creating a Ukrainian republic and building up Ukrainian identity as a nation. So while the USSR inherits most of the territories claimed by Tsardom, they promote their existence as nationalities that are not necessarily purely defined by their position in Russia. And so Lenin very much is specifically designing nationality policy alongside Stalin at this time as a means of weakening great Russian chauvinism with the ultimate long-term aim, a withering away of nation states and essentially a nationless future. So despite the stability of the USSR until its collapse, two separate Ukrainian identities develop post-1920s. You have Western Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine, with the interwar era as key for the formation of this split. Eastern Ukrainian identity emphasizes its unity with the USSR, while the Western Ukrainian national identity, which has its own tensions with Poland due to the annexation of East Galicia and Western Volhynia by the Polish Republic in the 1920s. Nonetheless, the Western Ukrainian identity embraces its own nation-building project in this kind of integral nationalist Ukraine. And they take this very particularist form of nationalism that defines itself in opposition to other national groups and in opposition to communism. So basically, anti-Semitic, chauvinist, anti-communist nationalism versus this other kind of Ukrainian identity that understands as more socialistic and internationalist versus this kind of national chauvinist Ukrainian identity, this nation-building project, which is defined by the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalism, the OUN, which is a fascist movement that saw themselves as brothers in arms of Croatia's Ustasi, the Italian fascists, and National Socialist Germany. So the Ukrainian national identity did not have to be inherently reactionary, and it is not inherently reactionary, despite what hardline Russian nationalists will claim. But it's disturbingly clear that the existing Ukrainian nation-building project that is dominant today does largely exist in a continuity with these troubling origins of the OUN. So post-Soviet collapse, we have three main large national communities that compose what was the former Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Ukrainian-speaking Russians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and just Russians. The new capitalist Ukrainian state would rely on the Ukrainian immigrant community and Western intellectuals for its ideology, seeking to make a radical break with its communist past. Yet this would not go full steam ahead, as the ethnic composition of the country made it prone to conflict. Yet it was clear that the ruling class was most favorable to this pro-European direction, emphasizing the West Ukrainians as the true Ukrainians who would educate and guide those in the East on their true identity. Things would go full steam ahead with Maidan, where the neutral President Yanukovych was overthrown by an alliance of liberal NGOs and far-right Ukrainian nationalists. While former presidents like Kuchma and Yushchenko planted the seeds of this nationalism, it was Maidan where it fully come to power. And I think it's important to point out that Kuchma was this Ukrainian president in the 90s who wrote this book called Ukraine, Not Russia, and very much promoted this idea of a Ukrainian identity separate from Russia. And Yushchenko, he comes to power in the Orange Revolution, which is kind of like the proto-Maidan. And he also very much is trying to do this pro-Western Ukrainian national identity that defines itself in separation from Russia and communism, and is, like I said, it's very much a nationalism that is particularistic and defined by what it's not. So East Ukraine is not as interested in being part of this kind of nation building projects where you have a lot of local capitalists who kind of use this post-Soviet, they run a lot of post-Soviet industry, and they kind of create a Ukrainian identity that emphasizes the Soviet origin of, this kind of elite, and they try to kind of mimic a form of Soviet paternalism without the actual socialist content. And this form of nationalism ultimately does not take hold of Ukraine as a state. Instead, the Western-backed NGOs and intelligence are able to dominate civil society and promote a pro-Western nation-building project that emphasizes EU and NATO membership. Ukraine is still a divided country post-Maidan. There's still a lot of divisions in the country, a lot of different ideas about national identity and nation building. But nonetheless, this is the hegemonic nation building project in Ukraine now, especially after Maidan. So, and the idea is essentially that Ukraine is going to become just like Germany. We're going to join the EU and become just like the West and be rich. That's, I've spoken Ukrainian Marxists who have talked to me about how, this is just a very difficult mindset because there's just a lot of delusions about joining the EU and this idea that, a semi-peripheral state like Ukraine is going to just be able to catch up with a state like Germany and not just become a pool of cheap labor if it's integrated into the EU. So one does not need to imagine that Russians in East Ukraine were brainwashed by the Kremlin to have a desire to separate from this new Maidan state that is basically embracing a national character that's hostile to their own national identities. And so, separatists in Donbass frame themselves as anti-fascist rebels and many draw on the Soviet identity. And I think at the beginning of the separation in the Donbass, I think you did actually see a potential for a kind of left-wing project. But as the Russian Federation intervened more and more, it started taking on a more kind of reactionary neo-czarist character. Russia did not send in troops, at least openly, but it did push for these Minsk agreements, which I'm sure we'll talk about more, that would have ensured a kind of federal system with autonomy for Donbass and NATO neutrality. But in the meantime, after Maidan, Ukrainian nationalism in the pro-Western sense grows, but there's still this national division, and it's not a straight line of growth. There's a Ukrainian Institute of Sociology study that finds that in 2013, 51% identify as citizens of Ukraine. In 2014, this grows to 65%, and it goes back down to 57% in 2017. And we can imagine that has probably gone back up with the special military operation. In the long run, however, nationalism triumphed and took over all political discourses, making class politics incredibly difficult. That's one thing to keep in mind, is that this kind of nationalist politics in Ukraine, this kind of anti-communist nationalism, this idea that you're not a real Ukrainian if you're like some kind of communist or anything, is very damaging for any kind of class politics, because any kind of class struggle is associated with communism. So after 8 years of failing to implement Minsk Accords, partly due to at least of sabotage of far-right nationalists in Ukraine, who clearly did want war with Russia, war eventually does break out. So we have the notion of a Russian world, which the Kulebsky is a mosaic involving the imperial paradigm, nationalism, Soviet patriotism, and the civilizational approach. And this is the state-building project of Russia. It is inherently a geopolitical project. The aims of a post-Soviet ruling class of capitalists seeking to unite into a coherent polity that can project its own geopolitical interests. It acts as a symbolic glue, holding together the ruling class, and it serves as an ideological legitimation to take actions internationally. It relies on the notion of a common Russian past. It doesn't really offer a new Russian future. Memories of the Kievan Rus and the Great Patriotic War do not serve to create a common link between Russians and Ukrainians. In support of Russian-speaking and Russian Ukrainians for Russia's invasion seem to be more based on opposition to the Ukrainian Maidan state and its far-right thugs. This project, more a state-building project than a nation-building project, is inherently at odds with the notion of a Ukraine that is defined in opposition to Russia and its greater unity with the West. Both projects, that of Russia and Ukraine, are inherently dependent on the support or passivity of broader geopolitical forces. They are national projects of local ruling classes, but their success relies on navigating the capitalist world system and negotiating it, whether peacefully or violently. This is now where questions of geopolitics or interstate competition in the world system become central. In summary, Russia is a semi-peripheral power that happens to have inherited nuclear weapons and decent military industry, putting it in a unique position where it is actually able to assert interests on the world state while being a raw material exporter. Ukraine is also a semi-peripheral state, which faced even worse economic circumstances after the Soviet collapse in Russia did. Yet Ukraine's pro-West nation-building project had allies far stronger than Russia, primarily the US and its NATO alliance. Where Russia aims to assert its geographic sphere of influence, the project of the USA is to assert itself as the hegemonic state of the entire global order, creating one global market with financial institutions that it dominates. In the grand strategic vision of the US, even before the Soviet collapse, Ukraine has held a key position. Subversion of Ukraine and promotion of Ukrainian nationalism was part of a strategy in the Cold War. We were openly supporting the OUN and the Banderite nationalists after World War II, despite the Nazi nature of their ideology. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, this doesn't stop. Geostrategic planners wanted to ensure that the collapse of the Soviet Union was not followed by the revival of Russia as a geopolitical competitor. And I'm going to quote Brzezinski here that he says, "It cannot be 1994 at the Council on Foreign Relations background on Ukraine." He says, "It cannot be stressed enough that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. But with Ukraine subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire." Making Ukraine a US proxy completely pliant to our imperialist interest would be key in keeping Russia in its position as a semi-peripheral raw materials exporter. What is happening is a power struggle over Ukraine, where one side sees itself as aiming to assert itself as a geopolitical power, and the other seeing itself as the only legitimate geopolitical power. Struggle between different visions of Ukrainian nation building has become intertwined in a struggle of global proportions. There can be no doubt that Ukraine is a proxy for the US, and that it is a tool in the hands of the US and its allies to weaken Russia and prevent its rise as a competitor. In the eyes of the US strategic planners, Ukraine is an anti-Russian frontier state. In the eyes of capitalist firms, it is a supplier of cheap labor. The dominant nation-building program of Ukraine, where the past is defined in opposition to Russia and its communist past, completely fits into this scheme. Ukraine promises a great future what will be like Germany, appealing to many, yet clearly appealing to many. If this is clearly not in the cards, as the blog I highly recommend, The Events in Ukraine, has shown. Instead, the future of Ukraine is as a dependency of the imperialist, kept happy through a diet of nationalism and IMF loans. Russia, on the other hand, has little on offer either. It draws on a glorious past in its attempt to unite with Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine, yet it has no real economic promises to offer. Memories of the Great Patriotic War combined with hatred of the Azov Battalion is simply not enough. Russia is instead engaged in a reactionary project of its own, despite the fact that it clashes with the US and NATO in this process. The USSR created a geopolitical unity where Ukraine and Russia were able to share a common future in building socialism. With the collapse of its promise, both states find they can only appeal to nationalisms that are completely antagonistic to each other. It is incredibly difficult to imagine this situation being resolved in a positive way without a rediscovery of this common socialist destiny. And that's it.
Thank you, comrade. I appreciate the comprehensive contextualization of the conflict. I'm going to open it up to the rest of the speakers. It will be up to you guys who wants to go next. You can volunteer yourself, or I'll eventually just pick someone.
Can we go in the order that we listed? I think it was Margosha, me, and Aaron. Great.
Sure.
Well, I think Donald touched on all the main points that I can really say in characterizing this conflict and trying to sort of think of what a stance for leftists, for communists, for socialists in the United States, in Western Europe, and the imperial court to take. I think that inherently both the idea of building a Russian exclusive state and also building a Ukrainian exclusive state are both disastrous visions that stray greatly from the multinational vision that the USSR had. And I know that Ukraine and Russia are very far from being nation states in their composition as well. And the idea of returning to a greater Russia, or the idea of an exclusive ethno-state for Ukrainians, is a very concerning vision and a very concerning project for the ethnic minorities that reside in Ukraine, for the ethnic minorities that do reside in Russia as well. Although the Russian Federation does allow greater sort of independence for these nations to sort of govern themselves in some capacity, although there is still that sort of Russian superiority that exists within the Russian Federation. Regardless, the government based within Kiev, the Western Ukrainian government, provides a very, very concerning offers a very concerning future for, both, Jewish Ukrainians besides opportunists like Zelensky, the Jewish Ukrainians that haven't yet fled to the United States and to the Zionist entity, for the Roma people still living within Ukraine, for certainly any queer Ukrainians who happen to try to define a life for themselves amongst this conflict and among these nation building projects. And the same can be said within the Russian Federation too, to a lesser extent though, because the Ukrainian nation building project is inherently way more exclusive, both in its vision and how it is playing itself out and trying to define itself, than the Russian Federation, which from the collapse of the USSR understood that it in some capacity was going to have to work as a multinational project. Although, as we see, there are attempts by Putin and other, other partisans, both in United Russia and also other major parties within the Russian Federation, to sort of harken back to this, mythical, glorious Russian Empire that existed in the past. I think that the correct stance for leftists in the United States, for communists, for socialists, for the left, generally speaking, is to understand that both the Kiev argument, or the Kiev government, poses a greater threat for the ethnic minorities living within the Ukrainian state than the Russian Federation has for its people. And not only that, but the vision that the Ukrainian state offers is as a, as an American or Western sort of proxy state within NATO, and as a sort of future cheap labor pool for the West as well. And as the United States continues to decline, and Putin and Russia's leadership try to align itself on an opposite pole, partnering with China and other sort of ascendant economies and superpowers in the world, I think that United States hegemony offers far few opportunities for a return to that multinational project that ultimately suits the Soviet republics better than this sort of Wilsonian idea of neatly balkanized sort of ethno-states that only devolve into further conflict down the road, because you can't split up the globe into neatly defined lines and expect there not to be, conflict in this way. Ultimately, Wilsonian vision of the world being divided into nation states is not a smart one. It is not one that is based in a proper future for people around the world. And I think that the ultimate priority should be returning the Soviet people to this multinational project, one that works for, ethnic minorities within Russia or Ukraine who don't have the opportunity to build an exclusive sort of ethno-state within that region. And so multinationalism should be the utmost priority to return to. And I think that under a unipolar sort of American hegemony, where Ukraine is, aligned with this Western bloc, offers far few opportunities to return to that than the opposite, a sort of multipolar world. And I think that in this way, there isn't an easy side to take, but there is a side rooted in the history of, what the United States hegemony means for left movements worldwide. And I think in that sense, a correct stance to take is one that weakens American hegemony and Western hegemony in general, because as we have seen, it has been the least, it has been the least receptive to facilitating, socialist experiments and left movements in general around the world.
Thank you. Much appreciated. Sam, would you like to go next?
Absolutely. So I want to just, we'll get into responses and back and forth, but just as a way of introducing what I want to talk about already, just want to call out Donald for the historical materialist analysis. I think particularly the articulation of the way in which this conflict does need to be seen primarily about processes of state formation and assertion on the global stage. We can't ignore the broader class formations at play here, but neither can we ignore the reality that state conflict has become a terrain of struggle on its own, setting the terms on which we need to analyze this conflict that is the terms on which it is raging through the Ukrainian landscape and entering its fourth month. And I think also for Margosha about advancing the question of plurinationality in this conversation, which for us as socialists organizing within the United States, I think is a particularly relevant question as we organize within US conditions. The way that I think about this conflict in general, I think also want to talk a little about the organizational and political aspect, right? What does this mean that we are doing as socialist organizers here in the United States? As a communist in the revolutionary social democratic tradition, my job is I see it as to identify, articulate, and build a solid majority orientation for the broader socialist left to advance a working class agenda. When I think about what that should be at the internationalist stage, I wrote a piece in Reform and Revolution talking a little bit about this that I'll link in just a moment. But the way that I phrased it, articulating what I believe the majority orientation for the socialist left to be, despite the fact that within DSA, I don't think there have been strong leaders advocating and pulling this actual majority orientation together, being one, unrelenting opposition to US military and intelligence guided intervention, two, principled but measured analysis of semi-peripheral capitalist powers who are in contradiction with US-led Western imperialism, and three, generous guided inquiry about global socialist experiments. I think there's a sort of caricature of this as the articulation of a campist position within the US left, and I think articulating that these contradictions between these different categories are real, even contradictions within these categories are real, but being able to take a guided and measured analysis to the different contradictions that we face on the international stage. I think another thing to think about with the with the situation within Ukraine, like has often happened with the United States's so-called, once ally, future enemies, with Saddam Hussein, Al Qaeda, ISIS, at times Saudi Arabia, and many others. The US created the Russian Federation in its own image post breakup of the Soviet Union, and now faces its own enemy on the world stage. Its role in the creation of the Ukrainian national project is apparent as well. What that means is that as we talk about national self-determination in the abstract, we ignore the reality under US-led imperialism, in that this is a sort of strange geostrategic pantomime routine that we're watching play out at the expense of tens of thousands of lives. So articulating then what was the political call at the beginning of the conflict? For me, I believe that the Democratic Socialists of America are the organization that is, best articulating that majority position for the socialist left, which is why I continue to organize within them. That is then, one, to highlight the US and NATO's role with continuous interference in Ukraine throughout post-Soviet history, Russia as well, but Ukraine particularly, going back to NATO expansion, Bush's speech in Bucharest, the 2008 election and the contradictions there, not to mention Maidan with the history of the sort of NGO, independent organizations that have these sort of strange affiliations and connections back to US intelligence and US State Department interests. Two, opposition to the Russian invasion itself as an irresponsible escalation that will lead to unneeded death and destruction, as well as exacerbate the political tensions at play, potentially justify further NATO expansion, and fracture any tense alliances that existed prior against US-led Western imperialism. And three, to call for a diplomatic solution, which includes commitments from Ukraine on NATO expansion and other legitimate security interests for Russia. I say that because this was the political call that the Democratic Socialists of America made at the beginning of the conflict, in the lead up to it, and as the conflict actually developed into a military one in late February. And I think then it's worth taking a second to do a little bit of analysis and say, how has this call held up in recent months? And I think the answer to that is incredibly well on all points. We've seen the ways in which each of these pieces of the dynamic have articulated themselves, and I think just really acknowledging the different lanes and structures within the conflict. So one, just developing, as we've continued, a further understanding of the US and NATO's role, not only in stoking this conflict to begin with, but actively supporting it and perpetuating it as it continues. Whitewashing the Nazi Azov battalion, including, if folks saw, I think it was in Mariupol, office with a bunch of German and Canadian business cards of military and intelligence officers present there. Not to mention providing active assistance with intelligence being used to target Russian military officers, and $40 billion of weapons for the conflict, which is of course a bipartisan consensus supported by both Democrats and Republicans. We've also seen, as was articulated at the beginning, a war that's dragged on with tens of thousands of deaths, a major injection of adrenaline for the NATO project, fueling further NATO expansion, distancing of the cooperation agreement released earlier in the year between Russia and China, as well as repression of socialists on both sides, Ukraine arresting and banning communist and socialist parties, further repression within Russia as well. As Margosha said, this is not a conflict that is going well for the broader socialist pole in either direction. We're also seeing extended active US intervention to stop a diplomatic solution. We know that the ideal situation for the US is a breakup of Ukraine and a spreading of weapons in the hands of various splinter groups, and they will organize for this outcome. I guarantee you somewhere in Langley, there's an Airtable spreadsheet with different factions rated on a scale of 1 to 5. You got to activate your 1s, marginalize your 5s. It's the same thing. We also then see third world countries largely taking a position of neutrality on the question. The reflexive response of direct intervention and military funding is not one being echoed by the global South, and is part of the broader position of neutrality held by a lot of parties outside of the direct influence sphere of Western imperialism. We also know, as we articulated in the beginning with sanctions and an active opposition to sanctions, that the US's approach has also backfired on the American working class, with gas prices, a broader inflation and potential recession, with the current political and military situation in Ukraine being at least a contributing factor. So again, going back to what was the political call at the beginning of this, that of course was, pilloried by the US White House National Crisis Response Group and sort of the institutional democratic establishment, as well as by many socialists who are in the minority position on international solidarity questions. I think we can see the ways in which that initial analysis really was borne out in all of its complexities, in all of its articulations. So then the question becomes, why does this matter, right? Like we're here talking about this thing. I have no button that I can push to stop any of this. I think it's worth noting that we are not in a second international moment. Proletarian revolution is not imminent, stymied only by our opportunistic Socialist Party legislative members voting for war credits. We do have an impact as socialists on the broader situation, but it's far more diffuse than in higher watermark moments for the socialist left in America or broadly. So then what matters, right? Like what are the things that are actually then important for us politically as organizers in this moment? I think number one, per the orientation above, there is work that we as socialists can do to vociferously muddy the waters against US intervention, blocking consent generation for the US intervention that we are ultimately powerless to stop, right? Like we do not have the levers of power to stop $40 billion from being sent to Ukraine. We do have levers of power to make it not a slam dunk and to make some people feel like that's weird that we're doing that, right? I think that is still an action and a concrete impact that we as organizers can take. I think another thing that is important with this on the broader political sphere is to connect domestic struggles back to the international situation, right? Using the orientation of our state, of the American state, to tie back to the struggles that American working class people are feeling, articulating that we're seeing $40 billion in military aid to go to Ukraine while a baby formula shortage is raging, that we have a continued expansion of sanctions while workers here in America are feeling the deflationary squeeze, right? Articulating that contradiction between the American state project and the interests of American working class people, I think is another political intervention that's useful here. And then third, talking about the way in which we are not in a second international moment. We are not in a terminal crisis of capitalism, at least at its most articulated form. The reality is that we can never predict in advance when that moment is going to happen, which means that this is also a sharpening of the spear opportunity for the broader left to be able to advance a clear analysis so that in future crisis moments, we are able to seize on whichever of these many contradictions of the US imperialist project become most salient in a moment of future tension. What's important to remember as we articulate our response to this crisis, our analysis of this crisis, is that a global socialist anti-war movement opposes not an abstract war, but as Marxists, we oppose wars in their concrete realities. This war with flames stoked and fanned for decades by US imperialism, triggered by a desperate and misguided Russian federations with designs of something bigger, this war must end, and we must be ready to build what comes next. Thank you.
Thank you, comrade. And finally, Aaron, would you like to go?
Sure. Thanks. Let me thank the comrades at Cosmonaut for the invitation. It's clear I'm representing a very much a minoritarian position on this panel, but I welcome the opportunity to do so. And I'll respond specifically to the other panelists, but I think in general, the thread that we're seeing to greater or lesser extents represents a kind of apologism for what's the proximate cause of the war in the Ukraine, which is an imperialist invasion by Russia. So that contrary to what Margosha says, that the greater threat in this instance and the cause of the proximate cause of the destruction in the Ukraine and the proximate cause of some of the subsidiary and subsequent crises and damage, whether we want to talk about oil and gas or food, including baby formula, lay with the Russian Empire. And to say that does not, and here I'm attempting to represent a position that's, also very clearly in contradistinction to a kind of social chauvinism. I think what you will hear from me is that the argument that the proximate cause of the situation in the war in Ukraine is imperialist invasion by Russia does not require any apologism or diminishment of the attempt by the US and NATO and its allies to make the best from its own imperialist perspective of the situation. So what does it mean that that the imperialist invasion by Russia into a sovereign and politically and militarily weaker nation of the Ukraine, what does it mean for us here in the United States? Well, it makes the war in the first instance a war of national liberation against imperialist aggression. And no matter how much we kind of want to spin the sort of history of nation building and the questions of the relative understandings of nationalism or in the Ukraine and Russia over a period of time, I think we need to understand these as always in motion, and the history is incredibly important. But it's also the case that the post 2004 history and is pretty profoundly was rewritten in Ukraine and is still being rewritten by the Russian invasion. So in these circumstances, we have to offer unconditional support to the Ukrainian resistances, plural, up to and including defending the right of the Ukrainians to obtain arms in the struggle from wherever they can get them. Any acknowledgement of the war as one of imperialist aggression and therefore national liberation, which does not also acknowledge the right to obtain those arms, and I haven't heard that position here, but I've heard it articulated elsewhere, is an engagement in political evasion. So Trotsky wrote in a famous pamphlet, Learn to Think, that where the arms come from in the context of national liberation shouldn't really matter. And so in some ways, the questions of the character of the national character of the Ukraine or the Ukrainian state is irrelevant to the question of the importance of resistance to imperialist invasion. So Trotsky wrote about a hypothetical example of democratic France supporting a colonial government in North Africa, where the resistance forces in North Africa were getting support from fascist Italy. And Trotsky argued that it was in those circumstances important to defend the right of the anti-colonial forces in North Africa to get arms from wherever they want. Similarly, I would argue that the right of Poland in 1939 to resist invasion and partition was the question of the Second Polish Republic, which is incredibly exclusionary of Ukrainians and Jews, stopped them from legal equality and language bans and prohibitions of entry into professions. That is to say, the Polish Republic at the time was in many ways reactionary, but wouldn't have prevented us from defending the rights of the Poles to defend themselves against either the Nazi or Soviet intervention in 1939. So we also must understand that the invasion of the Ukraine by Russia is not some random act of madness by Putin. And I think here we agree, or I agree generally with how I've heard it articulated by the other speakers. So however we assess this strategy, and I think the sort of strong distinction between a state project and an economic project, I would push back a little on, and I can maybe later in my responses. But however we assess the strategy is precisely that, a strategy of the Putin regime, and one which he very helpfully clarified in his speech at the beginning of the invasion, where he dismisses in its entirety Ukraine as an independent nation state and essentially blames the Bolsheviks for the creation of the Ukrainian nation. Quote, Soviet Ukraine is the result of the Bolshevik policies and can be rightfully called Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. And so I guess I would urge comrades, and I haven't read the piece in that's referenced by Donald in Cosmonaut, so I look forward to doing so. But I think that we can see that there's a kind of evolution of the kind of Ukrainian nationalism in all its manifestations over a period of time. And again, I think that's been in motion pretty significantly in the 21st century. But the Putin strategy is an attempt to rebuild the great Russian Empire and to build an imperial bloc counter to the United States. The invasion of Ukraine represents a qualitative escalation of a decade's worth of Russian strategy, but also, and I think Donald started here, represents a qualitative escalation in the inter-imperial dynamic between the US and its NATO and European allies on the one side, and Russia and China on the other. So while we should understand this war as one of a national struggle against an imperialist invasion, it is of course also true that behind this, as behind almost all such other historic examples, lies an inter-imperial struggle. We understood the Vietnam War as a national liberation struggle, which we called for the defeat of the US invaders, despite our, at least in my tradition, political differences and criticisms of the Stalinism of Ho Chi Minh. We did not reduce that war to an inter-imperial war between the US and its allies, and the USSR, on the other hand, and its allies, or as a proxy war in which we would have foolishly stood aside and said the working class has no side. Rather, we understand that we need to stand on the side of the fighters for national liberation, whatever our political critiques of the leadership are. And so, while simultaneously speaking to the perfidy and lies of the US and NATO and its machinations, which I'll speak to in a moment. It is essential that we understand that a victory for Russian imperialism in this instance is a defeat for the possibility of independent international working class movement against imperialism per se, which is a movement which is going to be absolutely essential in the coming years as the imperial rivalry continues to grow between these two blocs. So in the context of the inter-imperial machinations behind the war, and especially for those of us in the West, we do have to systematically call out the role of the US and NATO and expose their role. As the Secretary of Defense articulated a couple of months back, the strategic priority of the US in this war is a weakening of Russia. And this may mean that the ongoing war of attrition is a preferred outcome to a full-on Ukrainian victory. And to be clear, I don't think that there's any unanimity within the US ruling class or the Pentagon on this. And this is why you have Henry Kissinger, along with a number of other, Western European leaders, among others, and many thought leaders, if you read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, calling for a negotiated settlement. Just yesterday, the Ukrainian president, a long-term ally of Putin, noted that the Russian orchestrated food and gas crisis will only be resolved by a negotiated settlement. So I think that there's a convergence here between the interests of Putin and Russia and sectors of the West towards a negotiated settlement that would include the annexation of further Ukrainian territories, and which represent a tactical victory for Russia as part of a settlement. And I think this would be a defeat for those attempting to build independent international working class movements against imperialism. So I don't have the time, nor admittedly the expertise, to go through this in great detail, but I think it's important to look back at the Western aid packages, both civil and military, and assess them not just for what they purport to offer Ukraine, but also how they offer to benefit US domestic energy producers, its arms manufacturers, and financial institutions. And the role of the Western countries in their dealings with the Zelensky government have been full of examples of the ambivalent place of an unconditional Ukrainian victory in the priorities of the West. There has been no desire, at least except for certain talking heads on CNN for a direct NATO intervention. The West has been clear about this. Biden's been clear about this. That is not the interest of the U.S. state or the U.S. ruling class, let alone the Western European states. Similarly, the policies of the Zelensky government has shown its willingness to attempt to placate imperialism and its pursuit of neoliberal policies, speaking to the sort of nature of the class politics internal to Ukraine. So, for example, its opposition to any cancellation of the Ukrainian debt, which must be one of the left's calls, in my opinion. And the Zelensky's government's forcing through of draconian labor reform legislations, which has meant the escalation of the domestic class war in Ukraine, which admittedly the nationalist forces are hegemonic, but they're not alone. And I think we need to respect the kind of diversity of the political dynamics within the Ukraine and start our assessments from what's happening internally there and what the forces internal to the Ukraine are speaking for or asking for. So to address a common argument that we hear in response to the political position I just put forward, our support for the resistance in Ukraine is not conditioned on any illusions about what the Ukrainian government is. While we wholly reject the ridiculous assertion of the Putin propaganda machine, which would point to the entire Ukrainian polity as fascist or dominated by Nazis, we recognize the class-driven nature of Ukraine. There is a relative strength of the right, and the immediate and political and ideological gains made by Zelensky are real, but we recognize and actively engage with an emergent left and working class movement within both Ukraine and Russia. And I'll add some links when I'm done to the chat so people can look at some of this. This solidaristic engagement is only possible by taking on an initial stand of unconditional support for Ukrainian resistance to the Russian invasion. And this is where, I'm reaching my end, this is where there is a nexus between the strategic imperatives around our position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, narrowly written on the one hand, and the strategic imperatives for the Western left in the face of the growing inter-imperial struggle, which continues to qualitatively evolve in dangerous directions. In both instances, we need to be building an independent force of international and independent working class resistance to imperialism per se, in all its manifestations. And this, building the networks of engagement and solidarity with the comrades, trade unionists, and movements in Eastern Europe is incredibly important in the face of Russian imperial aggression, and given the history of Stalinist domination of the region over decades of the last century. It is not at all surprising that so many illusions exist within Eastern Europe and within the Eastern Europe left and trade union movement. So many illusions exist in the West and the EU and NATO. If people read the recent piece by Slavoj Žižek, one gets a sense of this trend, which I wholly reject, but needs to be combated. So it's only solidaristic struggle and engagement with these comrades that includes very clear critiques of the role of the West and NATO, that we can mutually struggle for an independent third position. And something similar has to be said about the need to build solidarity with the movement inside of Russia. And I'll share a link to an important interview that was made with the feminist movement in Russia. So, in conclusion, I think more than ever, we need to build solidarity with the Ukrainian resistance on the ground. It's defend its right to secure arms. We should build solidarity with the Russian left and the anti-war movement there, facing incredible repression. We have a responsibility to expose U.S. imperialism's hypocrisy in criticizing Russia. And in particular, we must oppose Washington's use of the war to expand NATO and intensify imperialist rivalries with Russia and China. There's a piece which I'll also share about the upcoming NATO summit in Spain, which is of great concern. The invaders of Iraq and Afghanistan, the supporters of Israeli colonialism, and the accomplices to Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen shouldn't be in any position to lecture other states on human rights. So we should, in this spirit, we should escalate the campaign for the U.S. and international financial institutions to cancel Ukraine's debt as part of the larger fight to get them to do the same for all developing countries. So there is a principled, clear way out for the left to oppose both US and Russian imperialism and stand in solidarity with Ukraine and other oppressed nations' struggles for liberation and build an international solidarity from below. And I think that I'll end very quickly here because the question was raised. I don't believe, given the debates and confusions on the US left around these questions, there is a basis for practical unity on these questions. I think we need to clarify the lines of the debate as the only way to rebuild a principled anti-imperialist movement in this country. I'll end there. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, comrade. So now we will go to the part where speakers respond to one another. My hope is that we can do 2 rounds. Let's try to have responses be about 2 to 5 minutes. And then after that, we'll open it up to Q&A, and we'll do maybe about 20 to 30 minutes. And hopefully we can actually, you know, if time permits, end before the 2 hours. That would be nice. But without further ado, I'll open it up to responses. Who would like to go first, or it's up to you guys. Otherwise, I will just pick someone. Donald, is that okay with everyone?
Yeah, then I guess Margosha can go next after me. So yeah, I have a lot of problems with the idea of Ukraine as a national liberation struggle, because I think what the struggle, seems to be about, when I hear Ukrainian nationalists talk about it, they talk about Ukrainian territorial integrity. It's a struggle not so much about the existence of Ukraine as a sovereign nation, but about the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And I think that when you get into this question of national self-determination, you inevitably end up having to ask the question, what about the self-determination of Russian Ukrainians who want to separate from Russia, who believe that they are facing national oppression from the Ukrainian government that has embraced this very exclusive and particularistic nationalism that, sees, Eastern Ukrainians who are Russian or Russian-speaking in a large degree are outside this identity that Ukraine is developing. So I think that when you get to the question of national self-determination, national liberation, it instantly gets complicated by the whole Donbass question. And I think that, in the beginning of the war, it did appear to a lot of people that Russia was trying to annex Ukraine entirely and annex the entire country and try to end the existence of any kind of independent Ukraine. I think now the nature of the war is increasingly over who controls the Donbass. And I think that in this sense, I don't think that we can support a Ukrainian victory. Because Ukrainian victory, as defined by the Ukrainian state, is essentially a national revanchist project. It means taking back Donbass and taking back Crimea and making it Ukrainian. And I think that considering the kind of talk that's coming from far-right Ukrainian nationalists that are leading the military struggle to take these territories back, I can't imagine that Russians will be treated as human beings in such a situation if Ukraine is actually able to successfully achieve its military aims. But about the question of national liberation itself, I think with Algeria, Trotsky is right that Algeria in that situation had the right to had to take arms and get weapons from whatever state it could in order to achieve its liberation, because Algeria was a colony. The French literally saw Algeria not even as a nation, but just as a part of France, and it was directly occupied by France, and the Algerians were fighting to throw off a occupation of the French and to form an independent Algerian state. An independent Ukrainian state was created by Lenin. I think that the national liberation struggle of Ukraine, if we're talking about national liberation in the same sense of Algeria, was already accomplished by the Soviet Union. And so I think it's very hard for me to see the Ukraine struggle as the same kind of struggle as the one being waged by Algeria, that was waged by Algeria, or type that's being waged by Palestine. And I think anything else I want to cover? Yeah, I think that covers it.
Okay, thank you. Who would like to go next? Up to whoever.
Margosha has her hand raised.
Oh, does she? Well, then go for it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the main sort of responses I have to the points that sort of Comrade Aaron mentioned earlier, is firstly, I believe that the sort of main call to action, or the subsequent resulting call to action, when we sort of declare unconditional support to the Ukrainian nationalist movement, and them, quoting you, sort of getting arms by any means, is to then sit by and sort of like, everything that you are hoping to accomplish, vis-a-vis American relations to this conflict is already being accomplished, where they're being given, upwards of $40 billion in arms, and that's a good thing. And that, America is doing wonderfully. America is doing great in relation to this conflict then. And I fundamentally disagree with that. And I think this sort of equivocation between a sort of like Russian empire and an American empire sort of diminishes how the United States and the West and NATO set the stage for this entire conflict, not just in Ukraine, but of Russia as it exists right now. There would be no Russian Federation, there would be no Putin, there would be no Yeltsin if it wasn't for the United States, the IMF, and NATO's sort of role in shaping international relations in that region. International relations being a very broad term that I'm sort of using here. And I think that we are at a point where, even though the United States is in decline, we cannot diminish the fact that we currently live, or the world currently exists, under Western and United States hegemony. There is no serious equivocation that can be made between Russia's power in this instance and the United States and NATO and Western Europe's power in this instance. And this, for the sake of this argument, because they all work in parallel here, I will refer to this sort of alliance of entities like NATO, the IMF, the United States and Western Europe as the West, generally speaking. And so to sort of say that they are on equal footing here, I think is, I don't think really speaks to the role that the West has set the stage for this conflict. And I think that a return to a sort of Soviet conception of multinationalism or of plurinationalism in the region is the direction that not only the left in Ukraine, in Russia, is trying to harken back to, but is something that the Western leftists, generally speaking, should be seeing as the positive direction to be going in as well. Because although you have described the character of the USSR during that time as Stalinist, it is the closest that the sort of mosaic of different ethnicities and different peoples in the USSR were able to get to not this sort of balkanization and this ethnic conflict and ethnic division that we see. More or less through the economic, the USSR was able to achieve a sort of pluriethnic society in a lot of ways. I mean, to speak to how the modern Ukrainian state with its current borders and everything, how it exists right now, and to describe it as something belonging exclusively to Ukrainians, I think it is a mischaracterization of the character of that country and the peoples that live there, and call that same strip of land home. And a Ukrainian ethno-state negates that. A Ukrainian ethno-state works in opposite to achieving that. A Ukraine that doesn't just work for white ethnic Ukrainians, but who speak Ukrainian and, you know, throw up Slava Ukrainians, all this sort of nationalistic fare, but one that works for the Roma people working within Ukraine, who have equal right to Ukraine as ethnic Ukrainians, by the way. The Russian speakers in Eastern Ukraine, who overwhelmingly make up, you know, places like Crimea and Donbass that were sort of described as being stolen from, you know, Ukrainians. And to wrap this up, I think just the parameters of legitimizing the Ukrainian nationalist movement, as well as the Russian nationalist movement, and equivocating Western and Russian power over this situation, I think is a mischaracterization, personally.
Thank you. Sam, would you like to, or Aaron, would you like to go next? Up to you guys, and then we'll do one more round. Hopefully we can try to keep responses within 2-3 minutes so that we can have a robust Q&A session.
Go ahead, Sam, I'll go last.
Beautiful. So I think I want to respond first to one very well taken point from Aaron around division within the ruling class on the question of Ukraine. I think it is more complicated than I articulated it at first. And so I think that's a real dynamic we have to acknowledge. The US state as it's composed right now, I think is best understood as a division of bureaucracies operating under kind of independent principles that go into a general direction, sometimes contradicting with one another. I think the bureaucracy who's most active in setting the terms for this conflict is, as I said, that which sees its project as pushing towards a breakup of Ukraine and a continuation of conflict beyond whatever the nominal end of this specific war is. But I agree that there are divisions within the ruling class and struggles around the goals of this conflict. So I think that's absolutely true. I think going into a couple of the other pieces with regards to Putin decision being the most proximate cause for this, I think that's absolutely true, right? Like this is a decision that was made by a concrete individual or a collection of concrete individuals that we have the need to understand, criticize, and articulate why we disagree with that decision, which I think, broadly, the left, the socialist left has done, and I think DSA absolutely did in its articulation. I think at the same time, if we're Marxists, we have to understand that, men make the world, but they don't make it as they choose. They make it under circumstances that exist outside of themselves and that they have to reckon with and operate within. And I think, to sort of put on a little, pinhole camera of this, particular decision and ignore the broader geopolitical context, it doesn't clarify the situation for us. Though I agree that going so deep into the analysis may make it hard for us to articulate a real political solution. We do need to have that concrete and complex analysis of how the situation came to the point that it is. I think similarly with regards to the right for obtaining arms or national self-liberation, I think it is worth noting that these rights, they don't exist in abstract. They're not, trans-historical concepts. They exist situated within global systems, concrete realities, and broader dynamics. If we want to turn to Lenin or Trotsky's writings on some of these questions, we have to acknowledge that they're situated by the decisions that they felt that they needed to make within their particular political realities, the choices they feel they need to make to hold their particular projects together, or also in Trotsky's case, after his failure in a power struggle within the Soviet Union, to react to what he believed his political project to be following that, right? These are all concrete realities that we need to reckon with. I think also within the context of the statement of the victory of Russia being a victory for Russian imperialism, I don't think it's necessary for us to go into like the question of imperialism and it's like, do we call Russia imperialist or not? I mean, my analysis broadly is it's a power that wishes to be in its current orientation. I think there are like developed qualitative realities that make that not quite an accurate description. But regardless, I agree there are designs of that on the world stage, and the goal of the Russian project is to develop stuff into an inter-imperialist rivalry. Again, I still don't think that these questions of like the China-Russia pole is a coherent specific empire or an inter-imperialist empire that is put together. Like, I think there's divisions and contradictions that we're seeing through like China trying to thread the needle in response to the Ukrainian invasion. And I think it just goes to the broader point, which is that the simplification of these conflicts into coherent camps is not an analysis from the anti-imperialist left as it's actually composed, but from those who are losing control of the broader socialist conversation, which is happening as the American imperialist project loses its valence and a broader multipolar world affects qualitative shifts, some positive and some negative. And I think we need to acknowledge when we talk about victory for Russia being a victory for Russian imperialism, the victory for Ukraine would be a victory for US imperialism, for the 50-year Fourth Reich that brought us the years of lead in Italy, pedophile networks in Belgium, and a global network of anti-communist assassination. Both of these things can be true at the same time, which is why I believe that the call for Ukrainian victory as the answer to the solution is a fundamentally campist view. It's just choosing a camp that I know I would rather not see the socialist left become a member of. As a socialist, I'm in the camp for peace, an end to this conflict, and not a continued escalation on the terms of the American imperial project. Thanks.
Thank you. That leaves Aaron.
The problem with Sam's position is it posits only two possibilities, either siding with one camp or another. And the central argument is that there's a third camp, and it's only via that third camp, which is independent working class international solidarity, that we're ever going to find a way out of this. It's not through the alignment of nation states. I do agree that the question of imperialism is complicated. I don't think Lenin's writings are sufficient for understanding today's geopolitical world. So I'll just put a footnote there and just say, I think we have work to do as a left to figure this stuff out. And then let me just try to make 3 quick points in addition. I don't claim any fantastic insights into what the people in the Donbass or Crimea want. I am very much aware that what I hear articulated here about the positions of the Russian-speaking people in those is very different than what I hear from people on the ground in those places and in Ukraine. And so I think we should have some modesty about asserting for certain what those people, what the Russian-speaking people or the Roma people or the people in the minority populations in Ukraine want. Especially given the nature of the invasion, because I've heard very different accounts of that, and I think some of it sort of simply serves, well, I'll leave it there. I think we need to more closely interrogate those questions, and I don't think I take very seriously the question of minority rights, the question of language rights, the question of the historical oppression of Jews and the Roma people, and I don't think it's inconsistent with the position I'm making. I think, in fact, given the history of the reality of the multinational state, it was very much a product of the Russian Revolution, but I would argue it was essentially destroyed by the Stalinist regime in the process of recreating a kind of version of great Russian chauvinism, which Putin actually acknowledges in his speech. So I think we need to not look to the USSR per se. I think we need to look back to the tradition of Lenin and Trotsky on these questions, because I think in recognizing the rights of national self-determination, only through that process can you come to a place where you can overcome the divisions of the nation states and overcome the divisions that are preyed upon by and used by imperialism. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Let's go for another round.
Yeah, you know, I do acknowledge that the USSR, you know, in the lead up and after World War II, did take a turn towards a more, you know, great Russian chauvinist system. Essentially, there was this kind of idea that yes, the USSR is composed of different nations and they have their rights and their autonomy, but in the end, you know, the great Russians are their big brother. And you know, there is, you know, I think there is true, but I don't think that all of the gains made by Lenin and the original nationalities policy were totally reversed. That's just a quick aside, though. I would say that I think that the third camp sounds great. I agree that we do need to have a third proletarian camp that arises out of the conflict and tries to stop the conflict. But I think that will come from war resistors in both Russia and Ukraine. I think that the proletariat has to show that it's not willing to fight this war to you know, take back the Donbass, and is not willing to die in the name of a territorial integrity of Ukraine, but that it is it's not in the interest of the proletariat to die for the machinations of NATO and this ruling class project that, you know, is responsible for this war. I think the ruling class project of Ukrainian nationalism is responsible for provoking this war. And you know, I look at the Azov battalion telegrams, and they all talk about how, you know, this war was going to happen whether we attack Donbass first or Russia, you know, attacked first. Like either way, like this war was almost inevitable. And I think it really does come across to me as a nationalist feud over whether this region is truly Russian or truly Ukraine. And I don't think that Ukrainian workers have an interest in dying in the name of proving that the Donbass is rightful Ukrainian soil. So I think if such a third camp is to develop, it'll have to come from both Russians and Ukrainians refusing to kill each other over these, you know, these essentially ethnic feuds. And that entails that we, you know, sabotage weapon shipments. I think Italian workers have shown very bravely that, you know, we can mobilize to prevent NATO from, you know, sending these weapons that are inevitably going to end up in the hands of neo-Nazis and other reactionaries. And I think that the message that the US and NATO are sending Ukraine is essentially keep fighting back as long as you can until you take back the Donbass and Crimea. And as long as you're trying to do that, we're going to keep the billions of dollars of weapons flowing, and we're going to keep indebting your country and making it into a dependency. And so I think essentially we have to oppose the weapon shipments. And I think this is my biggest difference with the Tempest comrades, is that I don't think there can be any kind of fuzziness around this question. I think we need to have clear positions, and that we need to have a position of making war on war. And that includes the Ukrainian front as much as it includes the Russian front. And I truly do think that, you know, the Ukrainian project, this project that we're going to fight this war to, you know, assure our territorial integrity and our oneness as a nation against the Russians, I think is very much reactionary. And the sooner that weapons are flowing in a limited sense, the sooner that the ruling class of Ukraine will try to make some kind of negotiation with Russia and keep the fighting from going on inevitably. I think ideally, you know, some kind of socialist revolution would happen. I don't think that's going to happen, but what I do think can happen is a socialist movement can take a principled position against the war and build itself through that position and show class leadership by taking the principled position.
Thank you, comrade. Who wants to go next? You can also feel free to, you know, not go. It's up to you all. Aaron, is that you?
I mean, I will speak if neither Margosha or Sam want to speak, but happy to.
Go for it.
I mean, look, I think at the end of the day, what's striking to me about Donald's last comments and Margosha's previous comments is that there's a kind of framework going back to Margosha's previous comments, it's always the case that the sort of state of inter-imperial conflict or imperialist domination sort of defines the sort of the context or the state of play at any given moment. It feels to me like there's a kind of sort of consistent reduction in the conversation of the fight, and you see this also in the initial DSA statement, to always sort of reverting back to the idea that this is just simply and just an inter-imperial conflict, and I think it largely ignores the voices that are coming from inside of Russia and inside of Ukraine. And so I guess this is where I depart from Donald, because I think we need to take our lead from those comrades and what we're hearing on the ground, which is that people on the ground who broadly share our politics and our perspective, understand the class dynamics, oppose the Zelensky government, defend the right of call for the multi-ethnic state in Ukraine, understand the class character of the Ukraine and class character of the dynamics over the period of time, fundamentally see the necessity of pushing back the Russian intervention. The Russian intervention was not just about, in its first instance, about the Donbass. It was about the attempt to take over the entire Ukrainian state. And that experience lives with people. And so I think that we need to be in solidarity with how people understand their struggles. And if people understand their struggles in the first instance as a kind of the need to defeat an imperialist aggressor in this context, then we need to stand with them as a necessary precondition for building the sort of international solidarity that I think we all agree is needed. And so we come to different conclusions about, I think the actions of the Italian and Greek workers in stopping the arms shipments is essentially in the service of Russian imperialism. And, I come to that conclusion not through sort of simply my stepping back and making an assessment of the relative strength of geopolitical forces, but trying to understand the dynamics on the ground within the working class communities in Ukraine who faced imperial invasion, or you don't have to call it imperial invasion, who faced the invasion and large-scale destruction of their country and deaths in the tens of thousands. And if the call there is to defeat that aggressor as a necessary step to build resistance to Zelensky, to build working class resistance in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, then I think that's where we need to take our lead. That's it.
Thank you. Would anyone like to go next, or should we open it up to Q&A?
I think opening it up to Q&A would be cool.
Absolutely, I agree. So the format is that please send your questions to Q&A. I will read the questions from the first to the last. The one that I got first, so to speak, will go first. The one that I got last will go last. I know that people would like to enter the debate themselves, make statements themselves, but because of time, unfortunately, we won't be able to allow that. I think it would make a bit of a mess of the thing. So I'm going to read some questions, and panelists can feel free to answer it. Please take 2 or 3 minutes, less even, because I really want to get as many questions out there as possible. And so, yeah, I'm going to read the first question. It's from Marxist Unity Group. So the first question: there seems to be a clear distinction between the policy that the IC produces and the voting records of DSA-endorsed politicians in Congress. That is the squad voting for full funding, for sending munitions to the Ukrainian army. How should DSA deal with the distance between its own programmatic policies and the political leaders of socialism in the US? And as a second question from Marxist Unity Group, does this war necessitate a dual defeatist stance by the left? That is, if you argue for defeat of NATO and Western imperialism, should Russian leftists also work for the defeat of their own state? I will open it up. Please feel free to just answer.
Can you call us in order? I think that would just be easier for everybody.
Okay, yeah, let's just do that. So Sam, why don't we?
You got me.
Yeah.
So do you want me to answer both now, or I'll do 1 and 2 at the same time?
No, you can do whatever you'd like, 1 or 2 or both or whatever.
I'll try to do them both in 2 to 3 minutes. So I think with regards to engagement with elected politicians, yeah, that's the question. I really think it's a combination of kind of on the organizational side of various conflicts that have happened, particularly around Jamal Bowman and the votes for Iron Dome funding. There's sort of like an articulation of, well, this is an organizing problem. We're not powerful enough to need Bowman to do anything. And there are those who are like, this is an administration and a policy question. This hasn't been a priority. You haven't asked people to do things. Why aren't we throwing our weight around, right? I mean, I think it's both. I think there needs to be both a more scientific and methodical process of engagement with endorsed candidates. I mean, I think generally a decision to try to reduce our engagements with congressional candidates until we're building up a stronger apparatus that's able to actually be a major partner in those coalitions broadly is a correct one. And I think being able to, build towards cadre candidates who are able to better articulate our positions is good. I think at the same time, this is also a question of, not just organizing, but also governance and management and oversight of DSA's endorsed positions and its structures, right? There was a failure from the National Political Committee to build out a Socialists in Office working group. There's a failure from both the NPC and to a certain extent the IC through the NPC to more proactively be engaging with our elected officials around a socialist articulation for international politics, right? As far as I'm aware, there's not a process by which AOC or Bowman are briefed by the DSA on the international situation. And that, to a certain extent, is simply a question of organizational priority and execution on behalf of our elected leadership. So I think it's a little bit of both. I think we need to be able to, build power more methodically and not jump into races where we're a more junior partner. But we also need to be able to be brave enough to use the power that we have, both the pulpit that we have as the largest socialist organization, as well as the concrete pulpit we have by the connections we have with our elected officials. With regards to the dual defeatist sense, I'm not sure if the term defeatism or revolutionary defeatism is exactly the applicable one in this scenario or the modern context separate from World War II. That being said, I do think the goal of developing the anti-war movement in the US parallel to the anti-war movement within Russia is exactly right. A dual withdrawal movement seems right, which ultimately kind of was what the defeatist line ended up being in World War I. I mean, I think we have to be circumspect about what that is, right? If we're doing if we're convincing Russia to do revolutionary defeatism while convincing US to send aid to Ukraine, I don't like that. But being able to stoke both the anti-war movement in America principally, and then, gather and amplify the struggle of folks within Russia, also advocating for withdrawal from the conflict on Russia's side and advocating for diplomacy and peace. I think that's good. Again, these are always concrete and specific. And I think without actually also doing that on the American side, it is not defeatism, it is campism. It is just being on the wrong camp. But yes, as part of a broader process, then I think that is a position to take, which again, just to be clear, was the position taken by the Democratic Socialists of America, which was advocating and amplifying the anti-war movement in Russia as well.
Thank you. I'm wondering what Comrade Doggo thinks on these positions. I see you have your dog with you. It's very cute. So next, Aaron,
her name is Da Vinci, and she just wants the supply chain of salmon jerky to continue.
Yeah. Okay, so Aaron, why don't you go next?
I'm in solidarity with that. I'll be very quick. I think my DSA membership lapsed last week, so I'm torn about this. I think New York is a particularly tough place to be engaged in these debates. Very quickly, I think that the DSA, largely the DSA electeds, has fallen pretty firmly into a kind of social chauvinist position, supporting the Biden administration's kind of cheerleading of NATO, et cetera. I think it's a real problem. I think that there's a different, I'll just say this, I think the difference between Bowman and AOC is that Bowman claimed to be a member of the DSA, and I think the issues around Bowman went more directly to the heart of what it meant to be a DSA member than simply, what the DSA endorsed electeds were doing. I do wonder long term whether there's an ability for, given the kind of the direction of DSA policy generally, and a kind of desire to kind of essentially build a kind of progressive wing of the Democratic Party, whether that's going to be able to live in tension long term with any of our anti-imperial positions in politics. And it's a sincere question. Very quickly on the question of dual defeatism, I don't think because I think it's a national liberation struggle, I don't think it's the right way to think about it, A. And B, I think that the kind of idea of a revolutionary defeatism, this is why I linked to the Hal Draper piece. I think that there's a real confusion around what it meant then and the different positions that Lenin himself took on it through a whole period of time. I think people should read that stuff and look at it, read Draper's piece, read Lenin's piece. I don't think it's as simple as people make it out to be. That's it.
Thank you, Donald and Margosha.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I've had a lot of problems with the way DSA has handled elections. I want to echo what Sam was saying about cadre candidates. I think that's what we need to be doing. We need to be running people who are politically educated and are in touch with political leadership and will be loyal to a political program and fight for the positions of our organization, and will be disciplined to fight for those positions. I think that the Bowman situation has made this clear to a lot of people. There's a lot of resistance to this, though, because there is an opportunistic relationship with the Democratic Party and DSA that a lot of people don't want to break from because they're scared or may benefit from it or whatever the reasons are. And I think that this has caused our electeds in Congress to take the wrong stance. I mean, I think voting for this $1 billion packages to Ukraine, I think that's essentially voting for a potential world war. I don't think it's necessarily the same as the war credits in World War I, which is not as historically intense. We don't have like a second international that's betraying its cause, but we do, in my opinion, have a lot of, we do have a failure of the left in this country to take a leadership in this kind of anti-imperialist struggle. And and overall, I would like to see anti-imperialism, anti-militarism, and all these things take a more central role in DSA's activities, not just on the ground, but in its elected offices. And I would like to see more action on that front. And I think the only way that this will happen if there is a change in the way that DSA conceives of itself and organizes. As far as dual defeatism goes, I think I already made my stance on this pretty clear. Like I stay in solidarity with people like Boris Kagarlitsky, who, are opposing the war in Russia. Boris Kagarlitsky, he was a member of the KPRF, but he's now, I think, being kicked out because he's opposing the war. And he voted for the recognition of Donbass and stuff, but he also spoke out against the invasion itself. And he has no love for the Ukrainian side either, but nonetheless, he opposes, the aggressive militarism of Russia. And I think that's what we need to be supporting, I think. But I will say this, I live in the United States, and the United States is taking a side. So I am going to focus on opposing, my own country's government and my own country's militaristic, imperialistic adventures, which I think, is clearly a big part of what's happening in Ukraine. Like I do genuinely think that the United States and its imperialist, deep state, or whatever you want to call it, have consciously engaged in a project of weaponizing, Ukraine as a tool to weaken Russia. And I think that we can't oppose our own ruling class if we fall into line with that agenda.
Thank you, Donald. Margosha, would you like to go? And also feel free, if you don't want to address the question, feel free to pass it on or whatever.
I mean, I will say about the question of electeds, DSA is currently at what I would call an extremely sort of, compared to where we want DSA and the organized left in the United States to evolve to in the future, we are at a very sort of infantile, sort of like fetal stage in sort of this development towards what we want to accomplish. Yet, DSA is currently at a point where, particularly the leadership, people who hold NPC positions, people who hold national leadership positions, and, are more in a situation where they call the shots on what we do as an organization, don't have any intention of moving beyond this current relationship that we have with representatives. There are many people who would prefer that we just keep on trying to elect, these AOCs, these Bowmans, these squad members, to where we have zero leverage over them. We are junior partners, and they have a very direct stake in keeping that DSA relationship with electeds like it is right now. Now, fortunately, everybody on this panel agrees that that's extremely insufficient. And if we ever want to be at a point where we are not just a sticker on, their flyers, and are actually in a position to advance some sort of Marxist anything on people in Congress, however you feel about that, we need to be building that kind of leverage with potential candidates and with DSA electeds. Whether we're ready to do that on a national stage, I generally don't think so quite yet. But we need to be serious about, within the organization, what we are going to do about this fundamental disconnect about what we do with our electeds. And in my opinion, I think that these views on what DSA's future is are fundamentally incompatible. One sees that we need to have some sort of principled Marxist stance, some sort of substantial Marxist or socialist anything, versus a candidate that advertises themselves as a democratic socialist, but at the end of the day, it is up to them and their staff entirely what they do once they're elected. I don't think it can continue like this. And I think that the factions that are opposed to this current status quo within DSA need to be serious about changing it and our electoral strategy altogether, or else DSA will remain in the stunted stage indefinitely. I think it's one of the fundamental sort of issues facing, what the American left should be doing. And I think that the question of dual defeatism, my line is the same as with Sam and Donald's, and the fact that although I am from the USSR, most of my family still lives in Ukraine, in Russia. In a lot of ways, my identity, I'm very much first generation through and through in that sense, where I kind of have these conflicting, sort of allegiances of which country do I really belong to. But I can say I live in America right now, and the reality is we are sending upwards of $40 billion in arms shipments to sort of keep the Kiev government in place because they are fundamentally aligned with Western interests. And I oppose that vehemently. Though I do not live in Russia right now, I'm not organizing in Russia. I am, I'm not a part of KPRF or Komsomol over there. I am not in a position where I can organize against what, Putin and United Russia are doing. But I don't think that United States organizers are in a place right now where they can substantially, tell, Russian organizers what to do there because they're in a similarly tricky situation. But they should be opposing arms shipment because that is what the ruling class is doing, and arms shipments help reinforce American hegemony, which we should be vehemently against.
Thank you. So a few things. I'm noticing that in the Q&A, people are sending comments. I'll be lenient. Try to phrase your comment as a question at least. Trick me. But if you really feel that you have to make a comment, what I recommend is that you send a brief letter to Cosmonaut or to Tempest or to whoever, right? And I feel that both parties would be perfectly willing to publish such material. And actually, we at Cosmonaut, at least I can speak for Cosmonaut, deeply encourage it. So really feel free, type up something, send it to us if you really must make a comment. So I'm going to ask a few more questions. I'm going to say that we can really only take maybe, let's say 3 or 4. The next one, though, is really primarily for a single panelists. So let's just have that panelist respond for the sake of time more than anything. But the next comment is from Joseph Perez, and Joseph asks a question for Aaron. So you justified a call for the Ukrainian government to receive arms from NATO, partly based on Trotsky's arguments and how to think. But in Trotsky's examples, Italy, Algeria, Belgium, Germany, all of these cases involve imperialist interests incidentally, like Italy arming colonial Algeria to hurt France, with countries that are not directly linked to imperialist power. But in Ukraine's case, a proxy war with Russia indefinitely with NATO weapons, taking political direction from NATO with the goal of regime change, is the main war aim of NATO. How can Trotsky's arguments be used in this sense to argue for pro-imperialist goals?
Sorry, if I could just have a second.
Absolutely, yeah. In the time that you think things through, I will ask another question for Donald so that Donald may respond after you. So Donald said that Russian Ukrainians, however they would identify, are oppressed by the Ukrainian state. What does that oppression consist of? How are they oriented between Russia and Ukraine? Donald, I don't know if you're there. You can feel free to answer first.
Hold on, I was running to the bathroom real quick. Yeah, you have various attempts in Ukraine to pass, language laws that would get rid of Russian as any kind of official language, and it's actually becoming more and more intense with pushing these kind of language exclusionary laws. And then you have just in Donbass, like I have people who are very close to me who have had their entire villages burnt down by Ukrainian military and the Azov battalion and stuff, where they grew up or their family came from, and I understand that Russia is also destroying people and buildings and terrible things like that, but like I know people personally who have suffered at the hands of the Ukrainian state because they are Russian and they're targeted by these far-right militias who are basically given free rein by the Ukrainian state. Now, I don't think the Ukrainian state itself is a fascist state, but I do think you have is essentially a bunch of liberal ruling class people, a bunch of oligarchs, and the Azov battalion as essentially thugs do their dirty work. And so I definitely think that there is a real oppression of the Russians in Ukraine. And but there's also a lot of dissatisfaction with the Russian state. So it's not simply that, if you're Russian in Ukraine, that means you support, Russia and everything is doing. So it's a complicated issue, and I don't want to homogenize Ukrainian Russians, but I do think there is a real oppression there.
Thank you. So Aaron, if you want to take a bit more time, or if you want to go now, I can ask another question, open it up to all the panelists. You can.
I apologize. Can you repeat the question? I have a partial answer. I just want to make sure I address it fully.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you justified a call for the Ukrainian government to receive arms from NATO, partly based on Trotsky's arguments and how to think, But in Trotsky's examples, all of these cases involve imperialist interests incidentally with countries that are not directly linked to the imperialist powers. But in Ukraine's case, a proxy war with Russia and definitely with NATO weapons, taking political direction from NATO with the goal of regime change, is the main war aim of NATO. How can Trotsky's arguments be used in this sense to argue for pro-imperialist goals?
I think there's a whole series of assumptions in there that I disagree with. The idea of the proxy war, or the idea of the sort of predominant NATO aim being regime change. I mean, I think this is, again, the context where I raised the Trotsky was specifically about not conditioning one's response to where the weapons come from based on the political character of the dominant political character of the state making the request. Sometimes people argue, well, of course, Vietnam, it's okay to get to support arms to Vietnam as a national liberation movement because Vietnam was more progressive than the Ukrainian government. And my point is, that question is irrelevant to the question of the national liberation struggle. But I think there's a whole continuum of positions of those states. I mean, I think there's specificity in any of these places about what's the relative the relative place of those countries asking for arms vis-a-vis the imperial projects. But I disagree with the idea that this is sort of fundamentally a proxy war, or that that somehow Ukraine prior to the invasion was somehow instrumental in a U.S. and NATO project of regime change, or even that regime change is the current goal of NATO and the U.S. Vis-a-vis Russia.
Thank you, comrade. I'll actually allow responses very briefly from, let's just say, one other panelist, and then I will ask another question, open it up to the panelists, and finally, I think we should close it up. But how does that sound, everyone? Good? Okay, well, I don't know if someone would like to respond. If not, no worries.
Yeah, let's go to a group question and bring it on home.
That sounds good. Let me find one that I find is interesting. Let's end it on this. I want to, unfortunately, our anonymous attendee, whoever that was, had a question, which is socialism more likely to grow inside of a Zelensky Ukrainian government or a Putin puppet regime or government? Curious what the panelists think.
That's a tough one. Because like the anti-communist laws in Ukraine are really bad. There's no doubt about that. And Russia does allow communists to organize, but they have to like prove their loyalty to Putin, essentially. So it does kind of seem like a lose-lose situation, I think. And so it really does come up to the working class to try to assert itself as some kind of independent force, regardless of how the war ends, to try to negotiate a better positioning. And I think ultimately, like a neutral Ukraine is the best possible situation because it's not going to be completely subsumed to either geopolitical power. And I think that, some kind of, I just don't think the working class is going to be able to get back on its feet in Ukraine unless there is some kind of mass disillusionment with nationalism and militarism of that country. And I can't predict the future. I can't tell how this conflict is going to end. I don't know if it's going to go on for 10 more years or 10 more weeks or 10 more months. We don't know. But I think it's very clear that there are not really great options on the table for victory. We don't have like an amazing solution that's open for us. We just have an endless kind of chasm of war and terror that's up ahead, and I just don't see either solution as presented by as presented by the two powers at war here as good for the working class. And I don't see the working class actually becoming an independent force unless it is able to completely reject Ukrainian militarism and national chauvinism, which is really hard right now in this war. So sorry for not giving a very optimistic response.
Well, thank you, comrade. I don't know who would like to go next.
Sam raised his hand first, so it's all you.
Go for it.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'd like to echo exactly what Donald said, right? This is the thing we also haven't talked about is the deeply extensive left repression that's happening in Ukraine right now, right? Like a bunch of socialists are in jail, being disappeared. It is not a good situation for the socialist movement in Ukraine right now. Neither as it is for the socialist movement in Russia right now, as well as Donald said, they're allowed communist organizing, but there's expectations that it follows the structure of the Putin regime. So I think again this goes back to the point I was making with regards to the real campism on this question, the articulation of a need for a negotiated settlement, an independent Ukraine that is able to articulate no further expansion of NATO and a withdrawal of U.S. security concerns, but retain national autonomy. That is a third solution to this crisis, which is the one being advocated by the supposed campists in this conversation, right? And I think that is the best outcome possible. It's the outcome that the Democratic Socialists of America have been advocating for since the beginning of this conflict. And I think it's the best outcome for the socialist movement and the working class in either of these countries.
Hey, you, Margosha, why don't you go next?
I will say that while the situation for the Russian left right now is not, great or even good by any means, I don't think that the situation for the Russian left and the Ukrainian left are on the same footing at all. Because while the KPRF is permitted to organize, so long as they, sort of demonstrate allegiance to Putin, that left movement has ties to labor, has ties to a lot more facets of Russian or society within the Russian Federation than the Ukrainian left movement, which is just, entirely not allowed. And so the KPRF is dependent on a regime, on an administration, or their power or their capacity to organize, while the Ukrainian left is beholden to a militant, highly organized, highly armed, highly funded, fascist Banderite movement that wants to see them dead. And not only that, has become a hub for white supremacist terror worldwide, as we see with the New Zealand shooting and the Buffalo shooting as well, how they have taken direct inspiration and even in some cases direct training from Azov and Ukrainian fascists. I think that the environment within a Kiev NATO-supported Ukraine is far more hostile to a successful left than the Russian Federation is. And I think that as time evolves and as regardless of what might happen to the Putin administration, I think that the left in Russia is way more, it has way better of an environment to organize than the left in Ukraine does. And that's my main piece on it. I think that the threat that Azov has not only for the left, but also ethnic minorities within Ukraine and Ukrainian people who, refuse to fight in general is far more vicious, far more rabid, and deserves to be stopped by a lot more of a serious concerted force. And I say this, not to get overly personal, but as somebody who familially has experienced what the Ukrainian fascist movement is capable of, you know, my grandparents and you know, were from the Pale of Settlement and were evacuated because of, you know, the Banderites and what they've done. And it's heartbreaking to see that cycle of Ukrainian fascism and Banderite nationalism continue itself, that cycle to repeat again today with the highly militarized and mobilized Azov movement. It's having worldwide implications, as well as we see with Buffalo and Christchurch.
Thank you, comrade. Yeah, Aaron, absolutely, go for it, and then we'll close it out.
Yeah, unsurprisingly, I disagree. I mean, I think well, I'll speak personally also, as somebody who has family whose roots go back to Ukraine and Belarusia and earlier examples of kind of chauvinist pogroms. I think that the reduction, and also somebody with personal experience of people on the Russian left who are currently in exile in Turkey, people who are in Putin's prisons for anti-war activity, et cetera. I think the answer, from the comments, I think Cameron knows, Cameron sort of anticipated the answer. The sort of reduction of all of Ukrainian civil society to, as defined by the Azov brigades, I think it's propaganda, to be honest. And I urge people who are listening to kind of pay attention to the voices on the ground and do their own research here. I think it is true that there's been incredible repression by the Zelensky government on sections of the left that have been pro-Putin in Ukraine. But there are sections of the left and civil society and the trade union movement that operate in opposition to Zelensky, that continue to operate as supporters of resistance to the Russian invasion and in opposition to the Zelensky regime. And our recognition of them and our solidarity with them is precondition for their survival going forward, should the Zelensky regime survive, because we're under no illusions about what the Zelensky regime would like. But I think we need to have a much more sort of nuanced understanding of what the shape of the Ukrainian and Russian polity looks like, and not get too caught up. And I just urge people to do their own research and read broadly from the forces on the ground, because it's pretty easy to cherry pick experiences.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, well, thanks to everyone for coming out on Saturday. This was, I once again, I thank our panelists. I think this was a robust discussion. It's actually nice to see a place where people can have comradely disagreement and debate. And I encourage everyone to go protest or get out against the reactionary rag of the Supreme Court. And having said that, thank you. I'll stick around for a moment or two just to